Moving on in Section 9 to the FTL service offering, this time from an operational perspective. What do BCOs moving goods out into a distribution network need to be thinking about operationally? Importers that contract for domestic FTL services need to have policies and procedures in place that consider the following things. First off, contract rates in place for consistent FTL lanes, meaning goods that are moving throughout the year from the same origin to the same destination all the time. Set lanes, 53 footers going from a transload facility in Savannah up to Chicago via truck, FTL all the time. Get some contract rates in place, understanding that there might be some peak season surcharges, but to the best of your ability, have some fixed contract rates in place. What should be pretty clear by now is the need for an understanding of all charges as well. That applies to ocean freight, to air freight, FTL, LTL, rail, etc. Get those charges out there, understand what they are and when they apply. FTL, although faster, has a tendency to be more expensive than intermodal rail service. What we're paying for, usually, are those quicker transit times. As we see in our third sub-bullet, there should be a service level agreement for those transit times and maybe some chargebacks or penalties to a trucker for not meeting those transit times. It's not out of the realm of possibility to see those types of stipulations in an agreement. It's just a matter of what can be negotiated and what's important. What are the methods and policies in place for spot quoting? Can a shipper use a freight broker? Can a shipper use a load board? Is it okay to go online and get a quote not knowing who the trucker might be? That's what we mean by policies on the use and methods for spot quoting. Getting a quote in the moment. That's what a spot quote is. It's not a contractual thing that's in place all the time. It's, we need a quote right now from the port of Baltimore to Columbus, Ohio. What are the methods and policies that are in place to do that? Another important policy that should be in place is on the use of asset-based common carriers versus truck brokers. Some companies, importers getting goods out into the U.S. market, have some pretty strict policies. One might be, we never use a truck broker, or we only use truck brokers. Or the policy it can be, we prefer asset-based common carriers, but when we get in a pinch, we use pre-approved truck brokers. Many different policies can be in place. It's just a matter of having them ahead of time so people can follow the rules. And then the last one, in the internet age, what's the policy on using load boards? Which implies from a shipper perspective that you are not necessarily going to know who the party is moving your freight. Load boards are convenient. They're market-based in the moment. Who has equipment where? Are there drivers available? Do they have hours of service remaining? And what's the price going to be? Those are all pretty important conveniences. The downside of a load board is not knowing who's going to move your freight. As a shipper, a policy should be in place for using those load boards. What other considerations are out there? What are the procedures for using team drivers? That's typically more expensive, much faster, but there has to be clear guidance for using a team driver situation. What tools or policies might be there for tracking tractors and trailers? As a quick example, any carrier that we use must have GPS on trailers and power units. Are there any required security procedures for high-value goods? Typically, smartphones, as an example, that are being moved via truck, a policy could be only scheduled stops are allowed, specific truck stops along the way, to avoid any nefarious activities, intentional or otherwise, that might arise. For high-value merchandise, are there any additional insurance requirements that the trucker must have in order to qualify for moving FTL loads? We mentioned hours of service briefly. We want to talk about it a little bit more in detail. Other FTL considerations, driver hours of service, the amount of time legally that the federal government in the United States allows a trucker to drive without having to take a break, have lunch, get some sleep, etc. One very important consideration for nearly all types of trucking activities, let's, for purposes of our conversation, say it applies to all types of trucking activities, is that of HOS, hours of service. Second bullet, In the United States, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, that we talked about earlier, enforces a law that limits the amount of consecutive hours that a truck driver can be driving. This is a safety thing, a fatigue thing. Last bullet, compliance with driver hours of service restrictions can have a material impact on domestic transportation lead time. That's really quite important, especially when a shipper is contracting for truck services because they're in a hurry and they don't have time to use intermodal rail. The whole situation, the whole story can get derailed, pun intended this time, by hours of service, especially if a driver runs out of hours. Let's see what we're talking about. It's very important for any shipper, but certainly an importer working the tail end of an inbound supply chain, to understand the specific HOS rules and how they may impact domestic transportation lead times. The HOS rules we're talking about are for property carrying drivers, truckers that move stuff, merchandise. Let's see what we have. First, said driver may drive a maximum of 11 hours after 10 consecutive hours off duty. We can see already that having an understanding and working with trucking companies that have drivers available with hours becomes very, very critical. Doesn't make sense to contract for a hotshot load going from Salt Lake to Denver for a driver that doesn't have any hours. That can get very costly and burn up a lot of time. Second sub-bullet, said driver may not drive beyond the 14th consecutive hour after coming on duty following 10 consecutive hours off duty. There are a lot of implications there around rest time and break time and such. We have to understand how this works and what it means to us from a lead time perspective. Continuing on, a driver may drive only if 8 hours have passed since the end of the driver's last off-duty or sleeper berth period of at least 30 minutes. Sleeper berth is the type of truck that has a cab in it in which a trucker can sleep. That driver, in those instances, may drive only if 8 hours have gone by since the end of the driver's last off-duty or sleeper berth period of at least 30 minutes. Second sub-bullet, driver may not drive after 60/70 hours on duty in 7 to 8 consecutive days. The 60 related to 7 days, the 70 related to 8 days. A driver may restart a 7 or 8 day consecutive day period after taking 34 or more hours off duty. As we can see, this is all about safety, about driver fatigue, avoiding accidents and even tragedies on the highway. It's really quite important. We have to understand it, we have to comply with it, and in the end, figure out how it might impact our lead times. One might ask oneself, well, how is this all enforced? Because it sounds a little hard to do. In our trade tip, hours of service is enforced on a driver-specific basis through the use of an ELD. That's an electronic logging device. No more handwritten logs for truckers. It's all very Big Brother-ish, and for a good reason, conducted through electronic logging devices, actual portable internet-based devices that record all of this information. We wanted to provide some of the actual excerpts from the FMCSA website as it relates to Hours of Service Driver's Guide. And we will note our source in the lower right-hand corner as being entitled The Interstate Truck Driver's Guide to Hours of Service. Let's run through it fairly quickly. It's really a longer version of what we said previously. At the very top, the Hours of Service regulations focus on when and how long you are allowed to drive by placing specific limits on the amount of time you drive your truck and how many total hours you can work before you are no longer permitted to drive a commercial motor vehicle, bearing in mind that total hours of work does not equate to total hours of driving. Truckers have to stop, they pick stuff up, they make stops along the way, etc. Essentially, the driver must follow 3 maximum duty limits at all times. The 14-hour driving window limit that we spoke of, the 11-hour driving limit, and a 60-hour based on a 7-day period, and a 70-hour based on an 8-day period duty limit. Without reading through every sentence here, let's make some clarifications on the 14-hour driving window. This window is usually thought of as a daily limit, even though it is not based on a 24-hour period. Here's the essence of the story. You are allowed a period of 14 consecutive hours in which to drive up to 11 hours after being off duty for 10 or more consecutive hours. The 14-hour period, the window, begins when you start any kind of work. Once you have reached the end of this 14 consecutive hour period, you can't drive again until you have been off duty for another 10 consecutive hours. 14 hours is about starting a given period, any kind of work, within which one is only allowed to drive 11 hours. There are a couple of examples there. Certainly, for even more detail, we recommend that one goes to the Interstate Truck Driver's Guide to HOS. This is just providing a window into the source of this information. This particular excerpt looks at the 11-hour driving limit during that 14 consecutive hour period, where it says, you as the driver are only allowed to drive your truck for up to 11 total hours. There's an example there, and also the regulation itself and where it is found. On the right-hand side, a little bit of color on the 60 to 70-hour duty limit. In addition to the limits that are explained above is the 60 to 70-hour limit. This limit is based on a 7 or 8-day period starting at the time specified by your motor carrier for the start of a 24-hour period. This limit is sometimes thought of as a weekly limit. However, this limit is not based on a set week basis, such as Sunday through Saturday. It is a rolling or floating 7-day or 8-day period. It goes on to explain what the limitations are there. Once again, we want to provide some color as to the source of where hours of service rules come from. We can wrap up this section with a real-world scenario entitled Team Drivers. An importer of wearing apparel that works with a 3PL transload facility just outside the port of Houston has to strip two 40-foot ocean containers that just arrived from Costa Rica and ship the contents in a 53-foot trailer to a customer's DC in Chicago. We're talking about a move from Houston to Chicago. This is a super hot shipment and has to be in Chicago in less than 24 hours. With a distance of 1,100 miles between Houston and Chicago, what options does this importer have to meet its deadline? Second paragraph. The first thing this importer has to be aware of is that it will be very difficult, if not impossible, for an individual driver to make this journey in the allotted time frame. With a distance of 1,100 miles and hours of service rules to consider, one driver won't be able to make it in time. Third paragraph. Apart from shipping domestic air freight, which in this case would be prohibitively expensive given the contents of two 40-foot ocean containers, the importer may consider contracting for team drivers that consist of two drivers taking turns throughout the entire trip. In addition to the team drivers, the importer will also have to confirm that the tractor has a sleeper cab that will allow the resting driver to sleep during the trek to Chicago. That's all about hours of service and such. Last sentence. While almost twice as expensive as a normal FTL service, this is really the only option the importer has if she wants to make the customer stipulated delivery deadline. Team drivers are great, but they're expensive. And there are hours of service considerations in there because both drivers need to have their hours, especially for long-haul moves that can go over a 3, 4, 5-day period. Yet another consideration that importers have to be aware of. We will stop here, and when we come back, as we see, we'll start getting into less than truckload transportation.